Nicholas Evans lived by the clock. Every second was accounted for, every appointment calculated to the minute, every distraction pruned away before it could grow into disorder. His assistants called him meticulous. His rivals called him ruthless. To Nicholas, the words were one and the same. Precision was not just a habitat, it was the very foundation of his empire. That morning began like all others. A car waiting before dawn. A silent driver navigating the city's arteries while Nicholas scrolled through market reports. Glowing across his tablet, his suit, a tailored light gray, was immaculate, pressed so sharply it could have cut glass. A steel watch with sapphire glass rested against his wrist, a gift to himself. After his first billion-dollar deal, he glanced at it now, as though the second hand could reassure him that the universe still moved to his rhythm. The courthouse was not the sort of place Nicholas frequented. He preferred boardrooms with panoramic windows, offices where every detail was arranged to his satisfaction. Still, business sometimes required dull errands, and this morning's task was nothing more than a final signature on a merger that had consumed his company for months. 20 minutes, he told himself, in and out, back in time to close a different deal before lunch. The marble foyer greeted him with its cold gleam, reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights above. Lawyers in press suits shuffled past, some muttering to themselves, others flanked by anxious clients. The metallic clink of the security gate, the clipped shoes on stone, the faint odor of ink and paper, all of it created a symphony of routine he found vaguely irritating. Nicholas never liked places he couldn't control. A courthouse was the state's domain, and in it, he was just another man following rules not his own. His eyes moved over the room, detached and appraising. He scanned the faces not to know them, but to avoid them. There was no one here who could advance his empire. No one who mattered beyond this morning's paperwork. Yet he held his shoulders square, his stride measured. Nicholas Evans walked as though doors should open before he reached them, and often they did. He thought about his schedule, a flight next week to Geneva, a dinner tonight with 2 senators whose approval he needed for a pending project. His life was a ledger, neatly divided into profit and loss, gain and sacrifice. People praised him for his discipline, but discipline had calcified into something else, a wall of order that kept chaos at bay, but also shut out everything else. As he waited in line for the clerk, Nicholas's phone buzzed with a reminder from his calendar. Lunch with the board's vice chair, one of the few men whose signature still carried weight in his world. He silenced it without looking. Time, he believed, was currency, and he was its wealthiest banker. He spent it with care, hoarded it with suspicion. Yet beneath the polish, there was something hollow. Nicholas did not name it, but he felt it in fleeting moments in the empty penthouse when the city lights glittered like strangers, in the perfunctory handshakes at charity galas, in the silence of his own voice when the applause ended. He had everything a man was supposed to want: money, power, influence. But desire had long ago been replaced by habit, and habit was a poor substitute for meaning. He did not dwell on this. He never did. Instead, he adjusted his cufflinks, exhaled in quiet impatience, and prepared to finish what he had come here for. Another errand, another task completed, another tick in the endless march of seconds. Nicholas Evans was a man who had everything except the faintest idea that before the hour was over, a handful of quiet words would dismantle the fortress he had spent his life building. Asterisk Nicholas had nearly reached the clerk's desk when something brushed the edge of his attention. It wasn't sound exactly, more a shift in the air, a presence out of place. He paused, his polished shoes clicking softly against the marble, and let his gaze drift toward the far side of the hallway. There, against the sterile white wall, sat 4 little girls on a bench far too big for them. They were still, too still. Children usually fidgeted, whispered, bounced their legs, or tugged at hems. These girls sat close, shoulders touching, as if stitched together by some invisible thread. Their feet dangled inches from the ground, toes not reaching the polished floor. Blonde hair framed each pale face, some braids neatly tied, others loosening as though no one had the time to redo them. Their dresses too yellow, to pink, were faded but clean. The kind of garments worn carefully because there might not be a second pair waiting at home. Nicholas frowned. In a courthouse filled with lawyers and grim-faced adults, they looked like misplaced angels. No toys, no coloring books, no parent, just 4 pairs of striking blue eyes scanning the hallway with an odd, quiet patience. He felt the first flicker of something he didn't recognize immediately, and unease. That had nothing to do with business. He should have looked away, returned to his paperwork, kept his world unbroken. But his body betrayed him, slowing his steps, guiding him toward them as if pulled by some force that logic could not dismiss. He stopped in front of the bench, lowering himself slightly so his gaze met theirs. Up close, they looked thinner than he had realized, their lips dry, their skin pale under the courthouse's fluorescent lights. The eldest, perhaps 6 at most, met his eyes steadily. She had the kind of gaze that belonged on someone much older, calm but exhausted, as though she'd learned long ago not to expect too much. "Are you lost?" Nicholas asked, his voice softer than he intended. The girl shook her head. "No, we're waiting." "For who?" "Our mom," another girl answered, her tone flat, as though the word had been rehearsed too many times. Nicholas glanced around the hallway. Lawyers paced, court officers shuffled papers, guards chatted near the metal detectors. Not a single adult seemed to claim these children. "How long have you been here?" he asked. The eldest shrugged. "A while." She hesitated, then added in a voice that cut sharper than any accusation, "We're hungry." The words landed like a blow, to small syllables, but they seemed to echo across the marble, ricocheting through Nicholas's carefully constructed walls. Hungry, not a complaint, not a whine, just a fact. For a moment, he did not breathe. He studied their faces again and realized he had misread them. They weren't quiet out of politeness. They were quiet because survival had taught them silence. They did not ask for help. They did not reach for him. They only endured. Nicholas straightened slowly, something tight coiling in his chest. This was not his business. He was not a guardian, not a savior, not a man accustomed to bending his schedule for strangers. And yet, he could not walk away. He turned sharply and approached the nearest court officer behind the desk. "Those girls," he said, pointing back toward the bench. "Who do they belong to?" The officer glanced over, barely interested. "Their moms in a courtroom down the hall. Some theft case. They've been out there all morning." Nicholas's jaw tensed. "All morning? Alone?" "Guess so." The officer shrugged, already returning to his paperwork. "Happens sometimes. Happens sometimes." The words burned in Nicholas's ears. The indifference was louder than the children's hunger. He looked back at the bench. 4 girls sat huddled, whispering among themselves, their movements measured, their small hands folded in their laps. They did not belong here, yet no one else seemed to notice, let alone care. Nicholas exhaled once, the decision made before he consciously weighed it. He turned on his heel, pushed through the courthouse doors, and strode down the street with the precision of a man used to command. 15 minutes later, he returned with bags from the nearest cafe, sandwiches, juice boxes, fruit, even a few cookies he'd added at the last moment without thinking. He set the bags gently in their laps. "Eat," he said. The girls opened the food carefully, almost ceremoniously, as though each item was precious. No tearing into wrappers, no fighting over choices. They divided and shared with a discipline that chilled him. One gave half of her sandwich to another. The eldest passed out juice boxes evenly. The youngest received help wiping crumbs from her mouth, a hand smoothing her dress after. Nicholas sat beside them, watching. Something in him stirred, something small, unfamiliar, and dangerous. He had thought he came here to finish paperwork. Instead, he had stumbled into a truth no merger could conceal, that wealth meant nothing in the face of. For little girls who asked for nothing but bread, and for the first time in years. Nicholas Evans, the man who had everything, felt the gnawing ache of not enough. Asterisk. Nicholas leaned back on the wooden bench, the sound of the courthouse muffled by the strange silence that had settled between him and the children. The food was disappearing slowly, carefully, not with the frantic tearing he expected from hunger, but with the quiet reverence of those who had long ago learned to stretch what little they had. He had seen disciplined boardrooms, had admired controlled negotiations, but never had he witnessed such restraint in children. The eldest girl glanced up at him suddenly, studying him with eyes too sharp for her years. "Are you a lawyer?" she asked. Nicholas almost laughed, but the sound died in his throat. "No, I'm here for papers. Just business." Her head tilted, braids slipping across her shoulder. "You wear a fancy watch, like Mr. Garrett." The name hit him like an unexpected chord. His instincts sharpened. "Who's Mr. Garrett?" The sisters exchanged a glance that spoke of secrets too heavy for their small frames. Finally, the girl in pink, younger but bold, whispered, "Mama's boss. He said she did something bad." Nicholas felt his jaw tighten. What did he say she did? She didn't do it. the girl said quickly, fiercely, as though daring him to believe otherwise. Mama said he lied. He was mad. He wanted to do bad things, and when she said no, he got mean. The words were simple, childlike, but they sliced through him with devastating clarity. Nicholas inhaled slowly, steadying himself. He had spent a lifetime in boardrooms with men like Garrett, men who wore their privilege like armor, who smiled for cameras while crushing those beneath them. Men who thought no was negotiable, that boundaries were obstacles. That power existed to bend others into silence. Nicholas knew the type. Well, he turned toward the courtroom door, the polished nameplate catching the overhead light. Judge Harper. That was where their mother sat, accused and alone. The weight of it pressed into him the thought of a woman stripped of resources, standing against a man shielded by wealth and connections. A rigged fight, invisible to most, and already halfway lost. He stood abruptly, his mind sharpening the way it did before a hostile takeover. Wait here, he told the girls, though his voice betrayed an urgency he didn't fully understand. He approached a passing clerk, his tone calm, but edged with authority. The case in Judge Harper's courtroom. Anna Ray, do you have the docket summary? The clerk hesitated. Are you involved in the case? I might be, Nicholas said, with a smile honed to open locked doors. I know her employer. I want to ensure the truth is heard. Recognition flickered across the clerk's face. Nicholas Evans was not an unfamiliar name. His donations adorned more than one legal foundation. After a pause, the clerk returned with a sheet of paper. Nicholas scanned it, each line deepening the burn in his chest. Theft of personal property. 1 count. Item. Patek Philippe watch, valued at over $8,000. The complainant. Garrett D. Brown. Nicholas's stomach turned at the name. Brown was no stranger. He'd hovered on the edges of deals before. A senior partner at a mid-tier firm with just enough influence to matter. Nicholas remembered the rumors. Questionable handling of female staff. Lawsuits that never quite made it to trial. Whispers that evaporated in smoke whenever scrutiny came too close. A man slippery enough to survive, venomous enough to leave scars no one dared to name. Nicholas folded the paper slowly, his thumb pressing against the crease until it nearly tore. He looked back toward the bench. The girls were still there, still quiet, still waiting for a mother trapped in a courtroom against a predator's accusation. He should have walked away. This was not his battle. Yet as he stood in that fluorescent-lit hallway, Nicholas felt a shift in himself, like tectonic plates grinding beneath the surface. He realized he was not simply looking at a court case, he was staring at a mirror, at every deal he had overlooked, every injustice he had allowed to pass because it was not his problem. Garrett Brown was the kind of man Nicholas had once tolerated for the sake of profit, and suddenly, the thought of tolerance was unbearable. He returned to the bench and sat down, his suit creasing against the rough wood. The eldest girl glanced at him curiously, juice box in hand. Do you think Mama will come out soon? She asked. Nicholas forced his voice steady. Yes, and when she does, we'll make sure she's not alone. It was not a promise he had planned to give, but as the words left his mouth, Nicholas Evans, man of mergers, master of precision, knew he had just signed a contract that would change everything. Asterisk. The doors of Judge Harper's courtroom groaned open, spilling a wave of weary faces into the hallway. Some shuffled out with relief, others with quiet defeat, their eyes glazed with the fatigue of battles waged against systems too vast to conquer. Nicholas barely noticed them. His gaze snapped to the thin figure clutching a stack of folders so tightly her knuckles whitened. Anna Ray. She was not what he had expected. In his mind, he had imagined someone hardened by poverty or defiance, a woman frayed at the edges. Instead, he saw a figure who carried her exhaustion like armor. Her dress was second-hand, but scrubbed clean. Her hair pulled into a bun that had loosened in the long hours of waiting. She moved quickly, eyes scanning the hallway until they landed on the bench. The change in her face was immediate. The sharp, guarded look melted into urgency, then softened into something fragile when she saw her daughters. Girls, she breathed, her voice breaking into relief. She rushed forward, kneeling, gathering them in as though to count them with her arms. I'm so sorry. I didn't know it would take this long. Did anyone? They ate. The eldest interrupted simply, her small hand gesturing toward Nicholas. He brought food. Anna's head turned sharply. Her gaze landed on him, suspicious first, then startled, then wary. Nicholas stood, smoothing the line of his suit, suddenly aware of how starkly he contrasted with the world she inhabited. He felt her measuring him in an instant, his polished shoes, his tailored jacket, the gleam of the watch on his wrist. Everything about him screamed privilege. The kind of man who never had to choose between groceries and rent. You did? She asked cautiously, her voice tight. He inclined his head. They said they were hungry. I couldn't just walk away. For a moment, she looked at him as if searching for the angle, the hidden cost. Her lips pressed together, resisting the instinct to accept kindness. Thank you, she said finally, though the words sounded strained, like they were pulled from her. You didn't have to. No, Nicholas replied quietly, but someone should have. Her eyes flickered, surprised by the sincerity in his tone. It unsettled her, perhaps as much as it unsettled him. Nicholas looked down at the girls huddling around her, clinging to her arms and dress. They were her anchor, and she was theirs. And yet he could see how close the tide was to pulling her under. Anna Ray, she said, as though reminding herself to stand straighter. I don't know who you are, but you should know. Helping us may not be safe. The words caught him off guard. Not safe? Her eyes narrowed slightly. Garrett Brown doesn't like interference. He has ways. He'll know you were involved, and he doesn't forgive. Nicholas felt something old and sharp stir within him. The predator's shadow lingered in her voice, and he recognized it. He had seen men like Garrett crush people under silence and fear. He had seen them smile while doing it. Let him try, Nicholas said, his voice quiet, but edged with steel. Anna's gaze lingered on him, conflicted. She didn't want to believe a stranger, a millionaire who could return to his glass towers without consequence. Yet something in his stance calm, immovable. The same posture that had carried him through hostile takeovers made her hesitate. For the first time into long, she wondered if she wasn't entirely alone. The girls, oblivious to the undercurrent, leaned into her arms, their small voices overlapping. Mama, he looks like Mr. Garrett, but nicer. The words were innocent, but they made Anna flinch, and Nicholas's jaw clench. A comparison that drew a line between two worlds. The man who had tried to destroy her, and the man who had, for reasons even he didn't yet understand, chosen to stand beside her. The courthouse buzzed with the rhythm of other lives. But around that bench, the air thickened. Nicholas Evans, the man who once measured life, only in profits, felt the weight of a choice pressing down. Anna Ray, the woman fighting to keep her children safe, saw a door crack open, where there had only been walls, and just down the hall, Garrett Brown was still inside the courtroom, his influence stretching like a shadow. He had not yet seen Nicholas, but soon he would, and the collision, Nicholas realized, would not be gentle. The courthouse emptied with the slow shuffle of justice, people dispersing into the bright daylight, each carrying verdicts like invisible weights. Nicholas remained in the hallway, a storm gathering quietly behind his composed expression. Anna had left with her daughters, slipping out before Garrett Brown emerged, but her warning echoed in his mind. He doesn't forgive. Nicholas knew what that meant. Men like Garrett didn't survive on skill. They thrived on fear. Fear was a leash, and every woman who'd worked under him had likely worn its chokehold. Nicholas had built his empire on numbers and strategy, but he had never confused himself with predators. Garrett was different. He didn't play to win, he played to ruin. That night, Nicholas didn't return straight to his penthouse. He bypassed the dinner with senators, ignored the buzzing phone on his seat, and drove instead to his office tower. The building loomed like a fortress of glass and steel, his kingdom. But as he stepped inside, he felt something new. This wasn't a sanctuary. Tonight, it was a war room. He summoned files, names, contracts, anything that had Garrett Brown's fingerprints. Garrett's law firm, tidy on the surface, had brushed the edges of Nicholas's world before. Always circling the larger deals, always just connected enough to matter, but slippery. Nicholas remembered whispers from mergers past, female associates who had resigned suddenly. Questionable invoices buried under billable hours. Settlements sealed with non-disclosure agreements. He had dismissed them as the inevitable shadows in business. Now, every whisper sounded like a scream. Hours passed. Nicholas combed through networks, making calls only a man of his stature could make. Discreet favors, hushed questions. And with every layer peeled back, the stench of rot spread wider. Garrett's name surfaced beside accusations that had vanished mysteriously. Women who had lost jobs after lodging complaints. A paralegal who had vanished from the profession altogether after accusing him of coercion. But worse was the pattern. Garrett wasn't sloppy, he was deliberate. He accused first, A stolen watch, misplaced files, fabricated thefts that painted his victims as criminals. By the time they could defend themselves, their reputations were ash, their voices muted, their credibility shredded. He had turned the law into his weapon. Nicholas leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. For the first time in years, he felt the old hunger not for profit, but for the chase. This was a hostile takeover of another kind, and if Garrett thought he could destroy Anna Ray without resistance, then he had underestimated the wrong man. But Nicholas also knew the risk. Garrett's reach was wider than most suspected. Judges played golf with him. Firms feared his retaliation. Even the smallest misstep could ignite a smear campaign against Anna, against Nicholas, against anyone who dared step between him and his prey. Nicholas stared at the skyline outside his window, the city glittering with a million indifferent lights. He thought of the girls for small figures on a wooden bench, sharing sandwiches with quiet discipline. He thought of Anna, clutching her folders as though they were the only shield she had left. This was no longer about a stranger's hunger. It was about the machinery of power, grinding ordinary lives into silence. And Nicholas, who had once worshipped power above all else, found himself recoiling at its abuse. His phone buzzed again. This time, he answered. A voice on the other end, an old ally in finance, hesitated before speaking. I don't know what you're digging into, Nicholas, but Garrett Brown isn't a man you want to cross. He's protected. There are things you don't want uncovered. Nicholas's voice was steady, low, dangerous. Then he's exactly the man I need to cross. The silence that followed was heavy, thick with the recognition of what Nicholas had just committed himself to. This wasn't business anymore. This was war, somewhere across town. Garrett Brown no doubt celebrated his latest performance in court. Smug in his untouchable fortress, he didn't yet know that Nicholas Evans had chosen to enter the battlefield, and Nicholas, for the first time in decades, didn't care about the odds. He cared about for girls, a mother's dignity, and the gnawing truth that if he walked away now, he would never be able to face himself again. He closed the last file, locked the screen, and exhaled. The game had changed. The man who had once measured victories in dollars now prepared for a battle that would be counted in lives saved or destroyed. The morning of the hearing broke gray and restless, the kind of day when the city itself seemed to wait for something to happen. Nicholas arrived at the courthouse before the clerks had fully woken it to life. He wore the same gray suit, polished shoes, and steel watch, but something inside him had shifted. For once, he wasn't dressed as armor. He was dressed as witness, as weapon. The courtroom filled slowly, murmurs layering over the rustle of papers and shuffling feet. Nicholas sat near the front, his presence drawing discreet glances from attorneys who knew his name but couldn't fathom his purpose here. He ignored them, his eyes fixed on the door where Anna Ray would appear. She entered quietly, shoulders squared against invisible weight. The girls were not with her, left with a neighbor, but their absence seemed to hang over her like a wound. She clutched her worn folders, though Nicholas knew by now they contained little more than scraps. Documents insufficient against Garrett Brown's polished machinery. Still, she walked with a kind of stubborn dignity, her gaze locked straight ahead. And then Garrett entered. The contrast was obscene. Garrett strode in with a grin tugging at the corners of his mouth, cufflinks gleaming. The aura of a man who believed the room already belonged to him. He exchanged laughs with a colleague, shook hands with a clerk, and offered Judge Harper a deferential nod as though greeting an old golf partner. His confidence was oil-thick, slick, and leaving residue on everything it touched. Nicholas felt his stomach turn. Here was the predator Anna had spoken of, cloaked not in shadows but in respectability. Here was a man who destroyed women's lives with the same ease he sipped bourbon at a club. Nicholas's fingers tightened around the armrest of his chair. The case was called. The People versus Anna Ray. Garrett's attorney rose, reciting the accusation with rehearsed precision: theft of a Patek Philippe watch from Garrett's private office. He spoke of trust violated, of a single mother desperate enough to betray her employer's generosity. Every word dripped with contempt, delivered as fact. Anna stood, her voice trembling but clear. I never touched that watch. He lied because her words faltered, fear choking her. Nicholas's body leaned forward, his instincts honed on hostile boardrooms screaming at him to move, to act. And before logic could restrain him, he was on his feet. Your Honor, the room stilled. Dozens of eyes swiveled toward him, whispers rippling like a sudden current. Judge Harper raised a brow. Mr. Evans, is it? You are not listed as counsel. No, Nicholas said, his voice steady. But I know Garrett Brown, and I know his history. Garrett turned then, his confident mask flickering for the briefest moment. Their eyes locked across the room to predators of different breeds, circling. Nicholas stepped forward, every move deliberate. This isn't the first time Mr. Brown has accused an employee of theft. It's a pattern. Intimidation, accusations, lives ruined, women silenced with settlements and threats, gasps whispered through the courtroom. Garrett's attorney sputtered, demanding objections, insisting Nicholas had no standing. Judge Harper's gavel struck once, but her eyes did not leave Nicholas. Do you have evidence? Nicholas inhaled slowly. Yes. He lifted a folder, his folder, built from the long hours and quiet calls. Names, dates, sealed complaints, testimonies buried under non-disclosures. Evidence that Mr. Brown weaponizes the law against those who refuse him. The silence was thunderous. Garrett's smug veneer cracked, his smile stiffening into something harder, uglier. This is slander. He spat, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. Nicholas looked at him, his own voice lowering, still wrapped in quiet rage. No, Garrett, this is the truth you buried under money and influence, and it ends here. He hadn't planned what happened next. Perhaps it was the sight of Anna clutching her folders like a shield. Perhaps it was the memory of the girls, whispering we're hungry in a hallway no one cared to notice. But Nicholas felt his throat tighten, his vision blur. The words trembled out, unbidden. You starved them, he said, his voice cracking, his eyes shining. For little girls waiting on a bench while you played God with their mother's life. They asked me for nothing, nothing, and you, his voice broke completely. The courtroom, stunned, watched as Nicholas Evans, the untouchable millionaire, the man of stone and order, bowed under the weight of emotion. Tears spilled, unrestrained, shocking even himself. The sight shook the room. Whispers hushed. Even Judge Harper's gavel stilled midair. Anna's eyes widened, her own lips parting in disbelief. And Garrett, for the first time, looked rattled not by evidence alone, but by the raw, uncalculated humanity of a man who had everything and yet stood weeping for children who had nothing. In that moment, Nicholas wasn't a CEO or a strategist. He was a man cracked open, his defenses shattered in front of strangers, revealing the one truth Garrett could not counterfeit, compassion. The balance shifted. The jury of eyes in that room, clerks, attorneys, judge alike, no longer saw Anna as a suspect. They saw her as a victim. And they saw Nicholas Evans, broken and unguarded, fighting for her as though his own soul depended on it. And perhaps it did. The air in the courtroom had changed. It was no longer Garrett Brown's stage. The swagger in his grin had withered, replaced by the twitch of a man who suddenly realized the walls he built for others were closing in on himself. Judge Harper adjusted her glasses, her gaze narrowing as she looked between Nicholas, Anna, and Garrett. Mr. Evans, you've made serious allegations. If what you've presented has substance, this court has a duty to consider it. Her voice carried a weight that silenced the room. Nicholas stepped forward, sliding the folder onto the clerk's desk. These are sealed complaints, Your Honor, buried under non-disclosure agreements. Different women, different years, but the same accusations. Theft, each followed by settlements that never saw daylight. The clerk opened the folder, flipping through the papers. Whispered shock rippled from the gallery like sparks from a fire. The pattern was undeniable. Too many coincidences. Too many women crushed into silence. Anna clutched her hands together, her knuckles white, as though the sight of those papers alone might finally lift the weight pressing on her chest. Nicholas glanced back at her, meeting her eyes for the briefest second, and she saw something there she didn't expect. Not pity, but solidarity. Garrett surged to his feet, his voice, once smooth as oil, cracked like dry wood. This is outrageous. This man, this interloper, has no standing in my case. He's interfering because he wants to grandstand. Judge Harper's gavel struck. Crack. Sit down, Mr. Brown. Her voice was iron. You'll have your chance to respond. Garrett sat, but his hands clenched the table, veins standing out against his skin. His carefully cultivated mask was gone, replaced by something raw and venomous. Nicholas remained standing, his voice steady though his chest still heaved from the tears he had not fully mastered. Anna Ray is not a thief. She is one of many women Garrett Brown has targeted when they refuse to bend to him. He framed her to destroy her credibility, the same way he's done before. If you allow this to continue, Your Honor, You're not just convicting an innocent woman, you're enabling a predator." The words hung heavy, undeniable. Judge Harper turned to Garrett. "Mr. Brown, these allegations suggest a repeated abuse of this court's trust. You will explain yourself." Garrett opened his mouth, but for once, the silver tongue faltered. The silence stretched, and with every passing second, the courtroom saw not a respected attorney, but a cornered liar. Then came the final blow. A clerk entered quietly from the back, carrying a document just faxed through. It was another complaint, fresh, from a woman in Garrett's own firm, an assistant who had vanished weeks earlier. Now emboldened by the chance to be heard, her testimony mirrored Anna's story almost word for word. The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, the rustle of papers like wind through dry leaves. Garrett's face drained of color. Judge Harper's gavel hammered again and again until order returned. "Mr. Brown, until these allegations are fully investigated, this case is dismissed. Anna Ray, you are free to go." Anna's breath broke. The folder she had clutched so tightly slipped from her hands, scattering papers across the floor. She didn't bend to gather them. Instead, she pressed both hands to her face, a sob shaking through her body. Not a fear this time, but of release. Nicholas turned toward her. He bent down, gathering the papers silently, and placed them back into her trembling hands. "You're not alone anymore," he said, softly enough that only she could hear. Garrett's voice cut across the room, hoarse with rage. "This isn't over, Evans. You think you can?" Nicholas met his glare, calm, unflinching. "It already is." Security closed in on Garrett as Judge Harper ordered him detained pending investigation. The predator, once untouchable, was finally caged. For a moment, the courtroom was utterly still. Then Anna reached for Nicholas's hand. It was not gratitude, not dependence, but something else: acknowledgement. He had stepped into her battle, not as a savior, but as an ally, and she accepted him as such. Outside, the courthouse steps were bathed in harsh afternoon light. Reporters swarmed, microphones shoved forward, questions flying like arrows. Nicholas shielded Anna with his body, guiding her down the steps. Her daughters rushing into her arms. The girls clung to her, their faces bright with relief. Then the eldest turned to Nicholas. "Mama says we don't have to be hungry anymore." Nicholas's throat tightened, but this time he didn't hide it. He crouched to meet her eyes, those piercing blue mirrors of her mother's. "No," he said softly. "You don't." And in that instant, he knew. His life of still towers and cold mergers had ended the moment he stopped at that bench. He was no longer a man who measured victories in profit. He was a man remade by hunger, by truth, by for little girls who taught him what it meant to be enough. The millionaire who had everything finally found what he had been missing. And as Garrett Brown disappeared into custody, the world witnessed the fall of a predator and the rise of a man who had finally learned how to fight for something greater than himself.